Thanks for volunteering to spend your time with us today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's fun.
I'm Eric.
I'm Elaina.
And we are two designers at thoughtbot. We are a consulting company that does both design and development. We're right down the street.
Yep, we do web applications, we do mobile, we do design thinking, we do lots of development, lots of design, lots of UX stuff. Anything design related we're
Pretty
doing.
much, yeah.
So we are essentially product designers. That means we work with clients. In our office specifically, we usually work with local clients in the Boston area, whether that's clients, businesses that are established or newer entrepreneurs that are coming into it and sort of want to iterate on their project, de-risk their idea before they build it. And we're working to help them scope that idea and iterate and test something really quickly. Mm-hmm. So we can see if this is going to be something that'll work out in the end.
Yeah, the idea is, you basically kind of, and we'll get into it a little bit, is you want to work really intelligently and, validate these ideas using kind of the best strategy possible and applicable. And sometimes that'll, be reflected in the kinds of exercises that we do. One such exercise is
a product design sprint. So a lot of clients, we start our engagement with them with a product design sprint. And so is anyone familiar with a product design sprint, what that is? Yes, some nodding heads.
All right.
Cool.
Scrum type of thing?
The what?
Like a Scrum, kind of like with the Post-it.
Yeah. There's like parts of that in that. So we use Google Ventures, sort of like I don't know if you have that book, like the Sprint book, but it's basically sort of like a week-long process where we're sort of scoping in on ideas, working directly with the client for the entire day. And by the end of the week, you end up with a prototype and you test it out with real users and you get feedback, and then you can, figure out if this is going to be something worthwhile testing, if you need to go back to the drawing board, if you need to tweak things, all that kind of stuff. So.
Yeah.
Do you guys focus more on software or hardware?
Both. It really kind of depends on the nature of the engagement. I'd say traditionally it's been more software than hardware, but one of the things we try to keep in mind is the solution may be agnostic to the medium that your company is currently in, depending on what you're trying to achieve. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the great thing about a product design sprint is that, like Eric said, it is very agnostic to the end thing. If you read the book Sprint, they talk about a lot about like hardware items, but it's basically, all it is taking an idea and de-risking it and figuring out if it's worthwhile pursuing. What medium that lives in doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So it can be anything.
Like historically, one client, we started with the idea that like this needs to be a full-fledged hardware, like a full-fledged iOS app. And it turned out that the answer was it's just an email that gets dispatched every so often. And like when we talk about de-risking, you're taking all of that development and design and QA and testing time and basically shrinking it down. Yeah.
Right, and it ends up like less frustration on the design team, and also like as the client or the person developing the product, you're saving money and saving time and energy by just like iterating super quickly.
And when you do these iteration cycles, do you bring in experts, or you have your like in-house engineers that like? I'm just asking because like this is something that we really like.
Yeah. So I mean, we do like full stack development. We're a Rails shop, but we do lots of different languages and coding. So we have in-house engineers, but sometimes clients already have a team going, and so what we do is we augment their team. So we work directly with them. So part of our deliverable is not necessarily the end product, but it's the process that we're putting forth. So they can, after we're done with our engagement with them, they can go on and move through this process and iterate like we iterated. So they can kind of add on to their product in whatever manner they see fit.
Yeah, we're not going to presume to know as much about your hardware as you do. So part of it is figuring out how that hardware is going to operate in the context of the greater world, or what challenges we kind of surface during the design sprint.
Yeah. Another thing that we'll bring up here is that at least the way we work is we work directly with the client throughout the entire engagement, which is usually might be as little as like a week, just doing a product design sprint, might be as long as a year. Usually it ends up around the 3-month mark, but we're working with them face to face, usually Monday through Thursday, we're not going off into our hole to design things and sort of present them. Because the most important part is sort of being a team, being on the same page, and that transfer of knowledge and communication throughout the entire process.
Yeah, and like that's expectation management on kind of both sides of the fence, where it's like we really don't want to have that like big reveal at the end where we've disappeared for 2 months and everyone's like, what is this? What have you showing me? Like, how did you get here?
Right.
So one of the reasons we're like so into the design sprint is because it combats exactly that.
Yep. So what is product design sprint? Ideas. It's ideas, it's validation, and it's the cyclic nature of building, launching, but not really, more ideas and learning.
Yeah, so the idea here is, as we're illustrating, we're kind of clipping out the build launch and not forever. It's just basically what we want to do is we want to get ideas generated early and as often as possible, basically build up, a collection of things that we want to investigate, see if there's fit in the problem space that we identify. Because the idea is like this is a lot tighter and shorter of a loop than building it, launching it, and finding out it doesn't work. That's a lot of wasted time and resources, and when you're working on making products, especially in the startup space, that means a commitment of time, money, and resources that are very, you have to be very choosy about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All your time spent. So we're going to go through just our basic process. We don't have necessarily a cookie cutter way of doing this. I mean, there are sort of guidelines for each part, but the activities may vary. We might do a shorter sprint, we might do a longer sprint, depending on the needs of the product. And the great thing about sprints is you can sort of iterate on it. You can kind of do what fits your needs. Mm-hmm. So the biggest part that always is sort of like the ramp up is preparation. So you need a lot of supplies for this. You need a lot of sticky notes, like enough to kill an entire tree. Sharpies is always good.
Yeah.
Stickers, paper, everything. Like you don't need your computer, you don't need your phone really. I mean, you need it for part of it, but most of your stuff you're going to be writing down. Yeah,
the idea here is it's ideas over polished final project. So like we find that like going immediately to a computer is, it's already overcomplicating something prematurely. So, the Sharpies and the Post-its are a little bit of a cliche, but it's really the fastest way to get ideas down on paper.
Yeah. It's also more on the fly, and it also provides some visibility in your meeting room. And so the next thing is you want a dedicated room. So this traditional sprint takes an entire week. You want to be pretty much, hopefully be in the same room the entire week, because that's going to be your war room. That's where you're going to be writing ideas. You're going to be drawing pictures, and you want to come back to those ideas.
Yeah.
You don't have to be moving things all the time, because that takes time, that takes energy. And so you want to establish one place where you're doing this entire sprint, this entire work.
You'll laugh, you'll cry, you'll learn.
It's a long week, I won't lie. Like you get home after you're at the end of one day and you're just you just want to veg. You don't want to have to think at all because you're just.
But another thing about when you have this dedicated room, it is vital to have people present throughout the entire process. So making sure that the people that are going to be working on the product have made a pre-commitment to being there.
Yep.
And traditionally what we'll try to do is get people, C-level all the way down to developers, depending on kind of the nature of the project. But if you are in on a design sprint, we expect you to be there.
Yeah. And then you have roles. So there's a couple of roles. There is a facilitator. So this person is the person that sort of if you have a whiteboard, they're sort of taking notes and writing down things as we have these discussions. Yes. They're kind of moving the schedule along throughout the day.
Same shirt over there.
Yeah. According to plan.
So good. So we're sort of moving this through. We're talking about it. We're having someone that's sort of just basically the classroom teacher for the day. So they have their lesson plan out and they're marking off. And a lot of times these discussions can go on for a while. So it's good to have someone to be let's table this for later. We got to move on to the next exercise. There is a note taker. So someone, so the facilitator is not sort of bound to taking all the notes. You have someone who's going to do that for you. And then we have sort of the decision maker. It's usually sort of the product owner, the CEO, They have basically veto power. They have superpower in decision making. It just makes everything a little bit easier. This is a very democratic process, but decisions need to be made, and sometimes there are ties, and sometimes one person needs to make those decisions.
Yeah. The other interesting thing about the note taker is, as it is 5 very intense days, and it is very much a blur kind of at the end of it, it's really nice to have kind of this historical context to go and review, because as we'll kind of get into, you do generate a lot of ideas that are technically probably pretty good in the longer term, just maybe not for the immediate need. So having that chronicled and written down somewhere to review is a very valuable thing. Hi.
So for this process, do you discuss an entire product, or do you do this for each feature of the product? How broad or narrow?
Can be broad or big. We usually try to scope it in. So we'll get into how we kind of scope that, but a lot of times it's we're talking about an entire product, but we're going to just work on this one part of this product, because you only have a week to do this.
Yeah.
So you have to really sort of fine tune what you're going to work on.
For a client I'm currently working on, it's basically they're facing a rebrand, but before that we came in to kind of ease the basically the sign up process all the way to kind of first transaction, with the idea being that before you unveil your product to the world, you want you want that experience to be as seamless as possible without alienating existing customers. And it was coming into the design sprint, they were like, we're about to redesign and rebrand, and we're not quite sure. So in actually doing the design sprint, we wound up choosing that as a direction based off of the exercises.
Mm.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind for these folks is the stage of the ventures are extremely early. So in some cases, it's a single founder that has no other team members, so in which case roles are a little fragmented.
Yeah.
And in other cases, there's a little bit more heft to it. But as you think about the best practices and lessons learned, to keep in mind that this is really early stage. Sometimes in many cases, they don't really have a sense of who the ideal customer is, and so it's less of the rebrand, it's more of the philosophy, which I know.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's an excellent point also, in that you might want to clarify. So as a founder, you may have an idea of what you want in the long term. You may not necessarily have the language to articulate it. So part of that is getting these ideas out of your head and triaging them and figuring out what's viable, what has market fit, what may be better suited for something down the line. Basically how to get you to market and in a stable position.
Yeah. This is a great way to sort of brain dump everything, and it's also a great way to rubber duck things. So I don't know if anyone has heard of the term rubber ducking, but in development, it's basically explaining a process to literally a rubber duck, or a person, or whatever, to kind of you work out a bug that way by having to actually really explain step by step what you're doing. You come to find where there are holes in a process, what you actually did wrong. Gets more clarity into things, and so this is sort of a way to do that, is you kind of by talking about your product with people who might not be so up and up in your particular industry. You are going to sort of find the holes, find the things where you sort of need to clarify.
Yeah. Have you all ever played the game of how to make breakfast, where it's how do you start making breakfast? Well, first you got to get out of bed. And that's kind of basically the rubber ducking thing, where you're just removing as many assumptions about the process as possible.
Yeah.
So, it's not pouring cereal in a bowl, it's walking down the hallway to get to the kitchen.
Yeah. One other thing I would like to say about roles is, so I know everyone's sort of new and you're basically the only people in your group, but if you grow bigger, if you gain a lot more people, a lot of these product design sprints work with a small amount of people. You don't want 20 people in the room. You don't want sort of this design by committee situation. You want maybe 5 or 6 people at most, just because having to discuss something with too many people gets a little bit unruly really quickly.
Yeah.
And then the first day, you're going to be scheduling some usability tests.
Who here has done a usability test before?
Cool.
Cool. Okay. They're great. I'm a big fan. You learn a lot about assumptions you've made about how things work in a very short amount of time, which is great. It may be a little humbling in the short term, but basically people are telling you what's wrong with your app and how to fix it, for a very small fee, which is great. I love it.
Yeah, there's a lot of products out there, a lot of websites where you can kind of schedule these things. If you're not really sure what your demographic is, if you just sort of want to pinpoint those and do some quick tests. Usually requires a little bit of a script, just so you don't go off topic and you have some clear goals as to what you want to find out. But they can be quick. They don't have to be this long, arduous thing. You just want to sort of gather some quick information.
Yeah, it's also kind of interesting to point out that like you are in charge of your product, but you aren't necessarily your user. So when you're sourcing people to test from, making sure that it's representative of the market you want to be in, it's one of those things where it may make perfect sense to you, but to somebody who is actually using your product, that connection, that mental leap may not be evident in that they haven't been thinking about this, 24/7 for the last few years of their life. And so it's one of those ways to make sure that like where you want them to be and where they go align.
I'm happy to share one that we used a million years ago at TripAdvisor, if that's helpful. The first time I sat in one, it was with someone that really knew UX, and it felt like it was this big foreign concept. And when you sit through it, you pick up like 50% of it in that first session.
Yeah.
And then you sit through a second one, like you have about 70% of it, and then at the third one, you can actually run the test yourself.
It's like super intimidating going into them when you don't know what you're doing. But yeah, you're absolutely right that you pick it up as you go along, and you kind of have like you figure out your own style of running them as well. So, and then you want to be gathering research as you go along. So this is like talking with people, looking at competition, documenting everything that you kind of come across, and writing down notes and writing down takeaways, all that good stuff.
Yeah, and that's kind of to the point of hardware knowledge. Like we are specialists in our industry, but we are not specialists in your industry. So making sure that the people that do have that deep knowledge, communicate what's important in their world, and the things you should know, the things you shouldn't know, acronyms, jargon, history, all these kinds of things.
I feel like one of the most important, like critical points in working with people who don't know what their industry is establishing a shared language, shared communication, because so many things, in my experience, have gone off track when you think one thing means one thing and the other person it means the other thing, and then you're totally ships in the night, and at the end you produce something that has nothing to do with how they envisioned it, because you had totally different, you asserted different meanings to different words.
Yeah, and can I just share one from a marketplace?
Absolutely.
So when we were at my last company, demand meant the advertiser, right? Because that's as an advertising company, is who was buying stuff. And then when we got acquired by eBay, demand meant the customer. So for the first couple meetings, we're like demand side, it'd be a good 5 minutes before like, wait, that's the supply side. And so it was something as simple as that.
Right.
Just make a little Rosetta Stone so everybody knows what they're actually talking about. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So yeah, like we said, there is competitive research. And it's basically the space you operate in, and then kind of beyond that a little bit, maybe not necessarily direct competitors, but inspiration or other apps or sites or products or services that have interactions or ways of behaving that you identify with, or you think there's something worth kind of investigating there. And that's one of those things where it's like, you don't want to just directly clone your competitor site for a lot of different reasons, but you also want to figure out what they're doing well, why they're doing it that way, what they're not doing well, why they're doing it that way, and then stacking that up against how you're going to do things.
Yeah, because you don't have to reinvent the wheel with everything you do. A lot of other businesses have done similar things for parts of features that you already want to integrate, and they've done that research, and you can sort of take those learnings and integrate them to yourself.
Yeah.
And so that seems like a lot for just preparation, but it is just sort of just getting like a full understanding of what you're getting into before you start this sprint. And so we have our first phase, which is all of the knowledge, all of the things. You want to understand everything. So we talked about this a little bit before, but this is sort of gathering expert opinions, knowing the industry inside and out. If you have something, a product going, giving a demo of that. Just making sure that everyone is starting to get on the same page. You won't be immediately on the same page. It takes longer than a day, but you got to start somewhere.
So you start with figuring out why you're all here. So it might seem like kind of a trite thing, but it really is, a common kind of overarching goal that everyone agrees that you're going to align with. And again, kind of in that everyone may be speaking this separate language. You literally put it up on the wall, and everybody agrees with it, and you keep it up there for the full week. So if you're ever kind of feeling like things are going off onto a tangent, what is our goal? Is that in the service of this? No, okay, throw it out.
Yeah, it's basically like a mini manifesto. It's what you want to achieve this week, what you want to achieve from your product. It can be sort of this umbrella thing. Can be something like, let's take the example, we do this sort of exercise with new designers coming into to interview with us. We have a mom and pop shop, and they do bike rentals, but they want to sort of expand their customer base. So they have like a lot of stuff going on, and you do your understand, you kind of like figure out what their business model is. And you define the sprint goal as, we sort of talked about it this a little bit, and it seems like they want to really increase their customer base. So your sprint goal might be, we want to be able to reach larger amounts of people by extending access to our bikes. And then that is sort of like your jumping off point.
Yeah. And another thing worth pointing out there with the goal statement is it's not we want a new app or we want a new website.
Right.
It's what is this app or website or hypothetical other solution going to, what do you want out of that, and is this the right kind of format to do that?
So I'm wondering, why isn't the goal defined in step 0? Don't you start the whole thing with the goal, or does the step 0 influence the goal?
You sort of want to learn about the problem space before you have the goal, and part of that is both internal and external alignment.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of times it's not like you're walking in and just defining the goal. You're having conversations first. You're kind of like establishing rapport and that shared language, and then kind of talking about how the product came to be, what kind of problems you've encountered so far, where you guys see yourself in the future, all that good stuff, and then you kind of start to hone in on what we can achieve and what are some major impactful areas that we can look at, and then you define the sprint goal.
Next up, we have the assumption board. And again, that's kind of getting that common understanding going. Assumptions kill products. Basically, the more of them you can get out of your head and onto paper, and somebody can look at and read and understand and say, yes, I agree, or no, you're completely off base, or given the parameters of this exercise, here are these things that we have this common understanding that may not be documented. It's important to get all those out early on. Yep. Because you don't want to wind up in a situation where you're a week before launch. Yep. And an assumption uncovers itself, and suddenly you have to throw out 3 months worth of work. And
this is a process that happens throughout the entire sprint. I'm constantly writing up assumptions that happen on day 1, and then as late as day 4. And this is the pivotal point where it's really helpful to have people in the room that don't know anything about your product, because they can see those assumptions right there, because they're not so enmeshed in it that they're blinded by what the product is and where you've been working towards. So
yeah. My favorite kind of assumption story was our market is for millennials, and then a little bit of talking and research later is your market is millennials all the way up to 60-year-olds. So that's a lot of market.
Yeah. So this is something that you want to be continually documenting and checking yourself against as you sort of go through your process. And then also along the way, you're going to have back burner ideas that there's just ideas that kind of come up that sort of blue sky, not even blue sky things, just ideas that happen that we haven't really focused in on what we want to make yet, but here are a bunch of ideas that could possibly kind of guide us, or maybe we'll come back to at a later date after the sprint.
Yeah. So basically then kind of what we're going to do is, and we should probably pick up the pace of the tad, define the product, review the existing research you've collected, and then review the competition. So basically you've gone out, you've collected information, you bring it back and you discuss it and synthesize it. You come up with this problem statement. So here, and it's interesting because you have your goal and your problem statement. So overall what you want to achieve, and then sort of the problem that prevents this from happening. And in this case, it's students don't receive enough guidance on how to develop skills that will enable them to grow and flourish. Sounds familiar for a couple of startups here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do we solve for that? And then we have our critical path. So this is sort of just like the storyboard of, okay, like Eric gave the example of how do you make breakfast? What's the opening scene? How do I get to my endpoint to solve my problem? You can just you basically are just going to write out each step to kind of get there. It might be as short as 3 steps. It might be as long as 20.
Yeah. The point here is also, again, figuring out all the things you need to accommodate along the way, but also what extraneous to getting there. So, you want to throw out, like in the breakfast making example, do you really need to turn on the radio so you have music to listen to while you make breakfast?
I do.
I mean, yes or no, depending on what you're trying to do. But
it's critical.
Yeah. So then is the worst day, the diverge day, where everybody breaks apart into little camps, and basically you've done all this work, you've had all this communion, and you've had all these conversations, and kind of bared your soul, and then we kick you out to go work on things independently. And the idea being is you sort of want to prevent groupthink from happening. That's another one of those big risk areas that you definitely want to make sure that it's the group dynamic. The group dynamic is not affecting kind of where you want to be. So it's one of those, like, you may not leave the room with a good feeling, but ultimately it's in the service of bettering the product.
I don't think we need to talk about the loop, but we can talk about mind maps a bit. So you're going to start out, like, a lot of this is sketching. And so you have your mind map, which is basically like brain dump all the things that you've been thinking about, whether that's words, pictures, paths, interactions. You get your scrap paper, you get a marker, preferably something thick so you can't like fine tune and get like, all precious about it. But
and when we say you, we mean you. So it's not a team
everybody.
of 3 people, it's you as an individual and your teammates as individuals, all doing these exercises by themselves.
Yeah.
Hence the diverge.
And then we do something called crazy 8s. You fold the paper into 8 even squares, so a half and a half again, and you get like these sort of like 8 boxes. And then you basically, we set a timer. I can't remember, it was like for like 30 seconds or like a minute.
It's like a minute.
Something like that, where you just basically, you get like 15 seconds each to kind of, or 8 seconds to like work on each square, and there's like a timer that goes up. It's very frantic. People freak out.
You lose control. It's great.
It's all right, but like, it's basically just a way, just like you just like really quickly, literally in 10 seconds, put something out there, put an idea on the square, and it really helps you focus in on like one core feature, because you can't get like really expansive with these crazy 8s.
The other thing I like that it does is it kind of breaks you of your preconceived notions of things. So like, your first 2 or 3 crazy 8s are probably going to be what the idea you carry around in your head. And then suddenly you have to think about, well, I need to have 5 more. So what else can I do? And it's one of those, when you kind of have this end goal where you want to wind up, sometimes you do get this serendipitous moment where you generate something that normally you weren't thinking of, but is a totally viable idea.
The other thing we get with this is a lot of people worry about like not being good artists or not knowing how to draw well for these, and you don't. It's not a requirement, nothing. Like, we've seen like the best ideas come from the people who are like so scared of this because they don't think that they're going to draw well. You can have perfectly beautiful drawn little sketches, and they might not be a good idea. It's all about the idea. It's all about the interaction that it's all about the story you're telling.
Yeah. So speaking of which,
storyboarding.
So you take these ideas and then you kind of flesh them out into a more viable scenario. Kind of a quick sentence about what's going on, how do you get there. Then once you've done that, you do silent dot voting. The idea here is you kind of, in that you might have a mixed product team where you do have a C-level and you might have a more junior developer. You basically want to take kind of a lot of the social dynamics out of play and just have some, one dot being one dot of a vote, regardless of who puts it down. Then when you start to see clusters, you start to see like what people are kind of collectively responding to, and then like how clearly did you communicate this idea. Mm-hmm. I've seen really great ideas with not so great storyboards and vice versa.
Yeah. And the storyboards are just sort of like these 3 sort of steps of like, okay, if you want to take your crazy 8s, pick a feature, and make a story out of it in 3 steps. Like, what would that be? And then you're voting on, you don't have to vote on an entire story, you have to vote on an entire square. It could be like a little bit like part of one that you really like.
Yep.
You're having all of the pages up on a wall, and you're walking around like on an art gallery, taking a look and voting.
The reason we do this is because then you have a group critique. So after you get these clusters of information and things that are noteworthy, you then talk about it. And again, you're removing kind of these assumptions. You're kind of delving into why are these patterns emerging? What's going on? Why did half the team put all their dots here? What's going on here? What should we do? Because usually what happens is like that means that there is a problem that everybody's kind of aware of, that somebody's responded to in a way that may be viable, or like you want to kind of incentivize that and bring it out and then get people talking about kind of the next steps you can take.
And you're doing this a few times.
Yeah.
You might need to. Sometimes it works out the first time, but sometimes you
Yeah.
need to like do that a couple times. And then you're going to come back and hang out with each other again. It's going to be good. Yeah. So let's talk about converging. So you have people that are sort of just like asking questions, and you kind of like walk through these sort of final storyboards of what you're going to create. And so we have like this voting system of our storyboards that we talked about before. Also, I forgot to mention, you give your storyboard a name, and so it's something like
So for the bike example, it could be like my bike checkout journey, or like calling the owner or something like that.
Something cool. That's something that sort of like names it. But you're going to pick one. You're going to talk about it. You're going to pick sort of like the ideas that you'd like, and then you're going to be creating your final storyboard. So this is sort of your journey, much like your critical path to get to the end. Sorry, any question?
So, going back to Diverge, what's the end goal of Diverge before moving to Converge?
The end goal of Diverge is sort of just to decide on some certain features that are sort of clustered around. So like, it's to kind of go through it maybe a couple times. Sometimes it just happens in one, but you're sort of honing in on specific features and ideas that could work out depending on how we voted.
It's also generating as many ideas as possible.
Right.
Which is why we break you apart.
Yeah, that's also where the super vote comes into play. Like if you have like the product owner, you're gonna, you need like a tiebreaker or something like that. You have your super voter.
Yep. Or I might have knowledge of the product that makes this one idea technically infeasible.
Yeah.
And then usually there we have a conversation, because a lot of the times infeasible and possibly feasible are 2 very separate things.
So in your final, I'll just kind of take a little bit at the final storyboard is like so you're basically writing out squares, and then you're like, much like the critical path, you're writing out like what each step is, you're drawing it out. This is what's going to be informing your prototype. So you need to be as detailed as possible to kind of work through what each step is, so there's no sort of questions about, or at least big questions when you're prototyping your products.
Yep. And then again, you're going to generate some ideas that are great. So you want to make sure that they hit the backboard. So these are things that you could visit later, depending on whether or not you have the time and the bandwidth for it. But it's also you're going to generate some cool ideas that just may not be as valuable in the immediate as they might be down the road.
Do you then add those into the need, wants, and desires?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes when we're talking about the features, they might be back burner ideas, but they might be things that like back burner might be like something that doesn't even have anything to do with our problem statement. They're just sort of like ideas that kind of come up. But yeah, that's just a sort of like a way to sort of like really like scope in on like what we actually need, things that we need to meet to make this an actual minimum viable product.
Yeah.
These are like everything is just extras, and desires is sort of just a way to sort of gauge like, what do we want this to feel like? What do we want people, to experience, with our product? Yeah.
So, if you're generating an MVP, say, is customizing your user profile, is that a need or a want or a desire? And it depends. If you're doing a social networking site, it may be really, you need to be able to change your color to match, your personality. But, if you're doing something more business oriented, that is definitely a desire.
Yeah. Assumption tests, you can, well, like we talked about assumptions before, as we sort of hone in on what we're creating, we might have even more pointed assumptions. And we might want to test those assumptions with our prototype. So we're going to write down those assumptions. How are we going to test those assumptions? And how are we going to validate them or invalidate them? Mm-hmm. What are the criteria for that?
These are the things that the group are kind of collectively unsure about that are potential barriers to getting, between you and success. Typically, as this graphic is kind of pointing out, you will uncover this with the user interviews because they're usually not kind of binary things. They're things that you want to talk to a person and figure out if it makes sense to them.
Yep.
Or a representative sample of people.
Yep.
And then
the penultimate step, prototype.
Prototype's the best.
Yeah. We're back in the loop.
We're back in the loop. So basically, you want to validate these things. So you have your assumptions. You're going to be testing all of them. You have kind of, at the end of this, you're going to be generating a thing. And that thing is going to be trying to satisfy as many of the assumptions that you've come up with. And the big kind of thing here is the thing doesn't have to be a polished final product. It could be a script, it can be a piece of paper, it can be a low fidelity prototype or a mock-up. It can even be HTML and CSS. It kind of just depends on the nature of the beast, basically. So it's one of those, does a mobile phone feel right? Well, you don't have to go and get a mobile phone and give it to a person. You can mock it up on a phone-sized piece of paper. Does this form factor feel correct? Mm-hmm. If your audience is used to the web, it may make sense to put it into HTML and CSS in the medium that they're more comfortable and familiar with the idea being that you don't want to waste too much time polishing it to the point where you're kind of getting diminishing returns on that effort. Yeah,
and just to frame the time reference of so you started on Monday, this is Thursday, you just have Thursday to prototype. That's it.
Yeah.
You need a day.
Yeah.
So it's just really that's the most frantic day. I feel like it's a little bit you're just crunched for time, but it really sort of forces you to make quick decisions and just to make something as lo-fi as possible. We make paper prototypes. We make InVision ones. Has anyone heard of InVision? Use InVision. Great. There's Sketch. There's there's plenty of tools out there that you can use to prototype your product, whether it's web or hardware.
With how many users do you test the prototype?
Oh yeah, we're gonna get to that. Don't worry. Yeah, so that's the last step is sort of talking to users. So. Guerrilla usability, yeah.
Guerrilla usability testing. Look to your left and look to your right. Those are people you can user test with. There's the hallway test, which is my favorite, which is you're walking down the hallway and you say, hey, try this out. There's that way they don't have the frame of reference and they're just going to use it like a regular person would. Yeah. But to your question of how many people you should be testing with, you want a statistically significant representative sample of your target population, which is kind of a wiggly answer, but it's usually around 5 to 7 to 10 people. And one thing you really want to make sure is that you're testing across kind of the demographic info that you've identified as your target market. So it's one of those, again, if you think at first that it's only millennials for your product, but it's in fact millennials to age 60, you want to make sure that user pool is drawing from those, that kind of amount of people.
Yeah. A big thing that you want to do to prepare for this that you might have, you have to break up into groups of some people doing prototype on Thursday and also script writing. You don't want to go into this without a script. You want to have questions that you're going to ask these people. You want to have them set up for times. You want to have everything sort of planned out of okay, so we're going to start by introducing ourselves. You want to be really detailed about how this conversation is going to go. Mm-hmm. You want to ask questions that are open. You don't want to have leading questions. You don't want to say something like click this here and open this up and what do you
why is this blue button so great?
Right. Yeah. Why is it so great? You want to be a little bit more vague. You want to be, more like, how might you change your user profile here or your picture or something like that? Yeah. And then just sort of let them lead. You're going to ask them, questions around what might be confusing to them, what seems a little bit odd, what seems off, what do they understand? Have them talk aloud. Talking aloud, I feel like I get the most out of. Yeah,
it's one of those kind of like you want to have just kind of the right amount of like letting there be an awkward silence because people will fill it, and then kind of back to the prototype thing just briefly, and hardware is also part of that spectrum where you might have an existing form factor. The question could even be, how do you turn this on? Mm-hmm. Or you may not need to spin up a production pipeline to make a physical model of something. It could just be a ball of tape, and you say, hey, this is a ball of tape, but it's actually a this. How would you do that? Yeah. And it's depending on if you get consistent answers from multiple people. That's one of the things where it's like, aha, we're on to something here.
Yeah. And you also want to be asking why all the time, or why do you think that? A lot of users will be like, well, I think if I clicked on this, it might do this. And yes, well, why would you think that? Why would you do that? Yeah. They might be asking questions, and you want to turn the question right back on them. You don't want to be like validating things necessarily. You want to get more information about what's going on in their head. So it's a little bit of like weird like psychological tricks that you kind of have to play while you're interviewing someone just to kind of get the most information you can possible.
Yeah, and again, like this is kind of the flip side of like a focus group, which we're not really into, where you're kind of de-emphasizing situations where you can get groupthink happening, or in a situation where people are giving you the answers that they think you want to hear because they're trying to please you rather than the answers that they themselves are thinking. Mm. Which is, it happens less in an environment where it's just one-on-one and you stick with the, oh, why are you thinking that way? And it's less about like, what do you think I want to hear? It's more like, what's bothering you about that? Or the other interesting thing is, and it's sort of just like a random luck of the draw, but when you do have your user pool, just kind of a little bit of conversation with them as well, where you can kind of, you might know your demographic info, but just kind of asking a little bit of like, about themselves, not necessarily in relation to the product, but maybe in the like, if you're looking for college graduates, like how soon ago did you graduate? Where did you graduate from? You might get details and like little bits about their life that actually will contribute to the product in a way you haven't thought about.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is like a lot of times like that's how I kind of like break the ice with someone while also getting information. Is like I ask them like questions about like their day to day that relate to what they're up to now. Like, a lot of times, like I'm working with lawyers right now and I'm asking them like, how might you do this? Or like, oh yeah, like how was your day? Like, how did this go for you? Like, a lot of times like they're venting, they're frustrated about something and you get some really great information out of that.
My favorite is like, oh, what does this acronym mean? They're like, oh, well, it means this. But, whoa, oh my God, well, like they want you over there to think that blah, 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 blah. And like 15 minutes later, they've like completely outlined your roadmap for you just by complaining.
Yeah,
it's great. So yeah.
That's it. So basically by the end of this, like what the goal is you've kind of answered some critical questions about your products. You have an idea of where you want to go forth, or maybe this might be, you got to the end of it, it didn't really work out, you need to start all over again, you need to rethink things. But the great thing about it is you've only spent a week. Mm-hmm. You've only spent a week of your time, your money, whatever. You haven't spent 3 months on something that, potentially would fail. So you kind of have a better idea of where to go now.
You have more consensus. You've also like bubbled assumptions and risk up to the surface in a very like friendly and safe environment where it's not, hitting the market in real time and then you're figuring out all these things. Mm-hmm. So again, a week's pretty cheap, all things considered, especially if you're keeping it low fidelity with paper and markers and stickers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. You have any questions?
I guess ways to bring this into like a day-to-day practice, like how can you spend a day on this or a half day on testing any features, since most of us won't be like sitting down for a week to create this process?
So a lot of times, sometimes when we're working with new clients that we haven't established an engagement with yet, they're just sort of like feeling us out and seeing like how we can work with them. It's like literally like a couple hours, and we'll take some of the activities from here. So we're going to talk about the product a little bit, and we might do crazy eights, and we might do some sketching and some critical path stuff, and that can answer a lot of questions. Sometimes it's just doing like some quick usability testing for like a new feature that you've implemented. A lot of these things we're doing along the way as well throughout the engagement. So we start out with a product design sprint, but we're taking bits and pieces just to kind of like gut check, verify things, making sure we're going down the right path as we continue.
Yeah. I find personally guerrilla usability testing to be really valuable.
Oh, yeah.
And you can do it in 10 minutes. It's one of those like walk up to somebody like on the street and be like, hey.
What do you think of this?
Yeah. People give you answers too. That's the best part.
Yeah. So yeah, it's I think all those activities are really handy. We have them outlined on our, it's like product, just look up product design sprint thoughtbot, and we sort of have all of these sort of activities lined out, so you can kind of pick and choose things that you might want to use.
Yep.
So how does a client or somebody engage with you guys? I'm just sort of curious how that works.
Like how do they come to us, or how?
Yeah. So like, is it like maybe startups, or is it like bigger companies? I'm just curious.
It's all different kinds. So like a lot of times, sometimes it's startups, sometimes it's bigger companies that it's a smaller, it's like a smaller part of the bigger company that they're establishing a new feature, a new product, or anything like that. So we work with all different kinds. Sometimes it's greenfield, sometimes it's something that it's established.
Any thoughts on the two questions of multi-platform and web versus mobile? Two of you have that.
Sure. So I have a little bit of a bias here, but there's Android and there's iOS, and that's already, you've doubled your developer requirements versus the web. Apps are very cool, but the web is capable of doing a lot nowadays, unless you need kind of specialized hardware access. So that's kind of one of the things I like to float by, where it's like you're married on the idea of, it has to be an iOS app. Well, why? What does it get you?
Right. Things like you design a responsive web page, fits on literally any screen, so it's pretty awesome.
Mm-hmm. Then in terms of if you do need a hardware mobile app, like if there's a reason for this form factor, really digging into like, you need to do this. Is this going to be in line with kind of the long arm of your hardware cycle? You want to make sure you're guarding against like Apple obsolescing the feature that your entire business depends on, then those kinds of things, because it has happened. Mm-hmm. Responsive design again is interesting because you sort of just get a website that works regardless of where you stick it or how you view it. Then again, like messaging channels. So like if you are going an app route, notifications. If you're not, email, those kinds of things. So like, once you sort of get that initial conversion, how do you keep them, re-engaged with your product or your service, and those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
My question was more on like the design asset management of that. So is there a practice that you use to maintain your design asset throughout multiple platforms, or even in your marketing campaigns, or like a company has certain design assets that they use throughout? Is there a certain management process that you go about?
It depends on the project.
Yeah, I like living design systems, which are sort of, you have your initial design step where you're taking like Sketch or Photoshop or Illustrator or what have you, and you're defining your components, and then once they're developed, it's, every time you hit compile, your style guide is representative of the minute what it's going to be. When you're dealing with device fragmentation, it's one of those things where just documentation isn't the most fun thing to do, but having a clear, well-organized kind of style guide to look at it and reference. And one of the things you want to keep in mind in iOS and Android are entirely different interaction paradigms. So like making sure that while it's visually has a cohesive look, that you're kind of embracing what the platform actually, how it interacts and behaves, so it feels more natural to it.
Yeah, there are a lot of like sort of like native features, like as simple as sort of like a multi-select tool. Like you have a drop down that has like it's going to appear differently on different platforms, and so you sort of have to come to peace with that, but while still keeping like the voice and tone through your design across the board.
There's I think it's Huddle.
Yep,
Huddle has a really good kind of example of that.
HUDL.
and like kind of they sort of mark like here's how you do it on the web, here's how you do it on iOS, and like breaking it down into the most kind of modular pieces as possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
18F also, they have a really great design system based on conversation and copywriting, which is also a component, not necessarily the visual sense, but it really feeds into the branding and how you're presenting yourself. They have like really great, and then I think MailChimp has the same thing.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm really intrigued by that piece of just like going out and getting the like, feedback. Do you guys have any advice where I'm in a situation where I'm like looking to get feedback from just a broad range of people, like not just within like accessible reach, but like beyond like in different parts of the country, different age groups. Do you guys have any advice on how to virtually reach them? Is there like tools that you guys use?
Yeah, there's one I really love, and they're local, userinterviews.com. They're pretty cheap. They pay you, you basically pay for an Amazon gift card and then a fee for the service on top of that. But they handle, like they have a really nice scheduling widget. They have logic set up for screener questions and stuff like that. So like, basic, are you over the age of 18? No. Thank you for your time, bye. And like you don't have to do all that hard stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually another good point though. And if you are doing non-user interview, like userinterview.com questions, but like just like people that you've culled from wherever, a nice thing to do is give them some little like present for taking the time out of their day to review your app. So if it's like a gift card or something, swag, stickers, whatever, just something little, just
Yeah.
it's a nice thing to do.
There's also kind of like the whole thing of qual versus quant feedback. So like if you have something up and running right now and you can investigate things like A/B testing to figure out, if you segment your audience, how are they performing?
Right.
There's also like Mechanical Turk is good too for kind of like, but you want to make sure that you frame it in such a way that it's a very quick, small decision, because the trouble with these anonymous things is you're not necessarily knowledgeable about everything that gets fed into it, which is again why I like having a person I can talk to, so I can get a better sense of like, when you say this, what do you actually mean? Like,
so where do you draw that line on user interview versus just brute, like get as much usage as possible?
User testing mostly for the kind of the unknowns, where it's like we have a general theory about how this wants to work, and then the A/B stuff is like we have this existing feature. Is it 10 pixels down, help conversion or hurt it? Like we already know people are using it, but yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Different places use it differently. Like kayak.com is like all A/B testing all the time. Like they're just constantly testing. And does red button or blue button work better? And then they're going to switch it as soon as like there's the
as soon as you get comfortable
there's
with
like
it,
a
they're going to
seesaw
change it.
effect.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. I guess that's kind of actually another point is like making sure that these tests are done in context, so you're not, they're not piggybacking off of each other, because it's one of those you might pull out the rug from underneath all these other assumptions you've
right. You're gonna have to
stacked
go
up.
bagot to like middle school science fair where like like okay, like what's I have my like control and I have like this one variable I'm throwing in there, and so you got to make it nothing's gonna be that clean, but you don't want it to throw too many things in there at once.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, we have a little bit more time if y'all want to meet with us afterwards and maybe talk one-on-one.
And also email us.
Or, email
We're happy to
us.
answer questions, whatever,
Also happy to get coffee at a later date. We have cards.
Yes. I didn't bring that. Oh, wait, no, I have it on mine.
And yeah, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks.